Tim, thank you. Well, Senator Webb has framed up the amendment. It is very clear, direct, simple, and the only change in the amendment since we had a vote which, as Senator Webb noted, garnered 56 votes, I think it was in July, were the two new adjustments that he noted in consultation with Secretary Gates. I would add, before we go to questions, that no force structure, no democracy can continue to grind down its manpower capability. That's what we're doing in Iraq. The fact is, our manpower capabilities do not match our mission. And I have heard the debate points on this, the talking points on this. Well, we need to enlarge our military. Yes. Senator Jack Reed and I had offered legislation on that point 4 years ago. And we were told by Pentagon leadership, by this administration, by members of the Congress that that was not necessary. Well, when you go back and recall what the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, General Shinseki, said at the outset, before we invaded Iraq, in open testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee in early 2003. He said, when asked the question, it would take hundreds of thousands of American troops to not only invade Iraq, but to occupy Iraq and help stabilize Iraq. Well, we're not going to go back and unwind all the bad decisions. The fact is, we are where we are. We're in a mess. But you cannot continue to load on to 1% of our society all the burdens, all the sacrifices as we are doing. It's wrong. We are seeing the consequences of doing that right now. 2 and 3 and 4 deployments. I'll give you a real-life example. Yesterday morning in my office, and you know that we've had a number of Iraqi war veterans on the Hill here the last couple of days, different points of view on Iraq, the future of Iraq. I had 2 Nebraskans in my office, both Marines. One was a Marine officer, a couple of tours in Iraq, 14 years. He's out. This is as gung-ho a Marine as I have ever met. I guess all Marines are gung-ho. I was never smart enough to be a Marine. But nonetheless, I do respect their service. And I asked this 14-year Marine officer, a couple of tours in Iraq, why did you get out? He said, I could not sustain a family life. I couldn't sustain what I felt was important to balancing my responsibilities as a father, as a husband. And he said, it just ripped my soul out to have to leave the Corps. Well, this is not an isolated example. I mean, we know the numbers. We cannot continue to look at war and the people who fight and die in wars as abstractions, as pawns, as objects. And we do too much of that in Washington. This somehow is framed always in policy dynamics. The humanity of this is lost. Now, there are times when a nation must defend itself, when a nation must go to war. That's not the issue. But what we are doing here to our force structure, we're destroying our force structure. And I find it astounding that any senior military official, including the President, who is not a senior military official other than the fact he's Commander-in-Chief, including Secretary Gates, who I admire greatly, could argue against giving these brave men and women the decency of allowing them the same amount of time at home that we're asking them to put in a combat zone. Somehow that seems foreign to some of these people. Well, it's wrong. It's wrong. And yes, we're going to have to adjust our military manpower capability. We now know that. But it's unfair to continue to load this burden on these same people, deployment after deployment. And not only will you ruin your military, and it'll take the same amount of time that it took to rebuild a military after the disaster in Vietnam, which Senator Webb and I know something about, as others do in this Congress. But it will also have an impact on our society. because a democracy cannot continue to function when you ask 1% of a country to make all the sacrifices and carry all the burden. And then when you're asked the tough questions, we just somehow defer it. Say, well, we'll get a bigger military. We'll make a bigger military. No, that's not going to happen. Last point I would make. Since this vote was taken in July on this amendment, things have not gotten better in Iraq. They've gotten worse in Iraq. I mean, if you look at the newspapers today that many of you represent, it's pretty clear, whether it's in Basra, whether it's in southern Iraq, whether it's no progress on the political reconciliation front, which in the end is the only thing that counts. So I think this amendment is more relevant today than it was when we had a vote in July. I hope there will be a number of our colleagues that will give consideration to this and vote differently than they did in July. And I also would end by acknowledging Secretary, and I say Secretary Webb intentionally because this man was a leader in the Pentagon for a number of years in two major assignments. His most recent was Secretary of Navy. He understands something about manpower. He understands something about a military. He understands this issue more than just in the framework of abstractions and policy. So I appreciate Jim Webb's leadership and his forcefulness and his sense of purpose. We'd be very glad for questions.